Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we will look at a Star of David that invokes memories of bravery, a signal lamp pioneered by the British Royal Navy, and a photojournal filled with memorabilia from the Second World War. Mark People looks at a photojournal that was put together by a door gunner during the Second World War.
They stayed underneath the foliage the next morning when the German army woke them up and marched all the soldiers off. The only problem was they left two behind.
Roger Masters looks at a signal lamp, a nautical war light used for naval communication at nightfall.
Vessels did not sail individually as a rule. They would generally travel in convoys with naval escorts. These signal lamps allowed you to make those difficult course corrections at sea.
Gary Melville looks at a Star of David used as a means of identifying the Jewish population in Nazi-occupied Europe.
The Jewish people had to buy these stars themselves. The Jewish people weren't allowed to work, so they had no income whatsoever, and tried to make them last as much as they could.
I'm Bill Thompson, and today I brought in a Admiralty lamp. I belong to a reenactment group that does everything from World War I right up to Korea. I used to use the lamp in one of my static displays. I started collecting at a very young age, and I know very little about the signal lantern other than it's Navy and it was used for visual communication at night.
Militaries have used signals to communicate coded information over long distances throughout history. 3,000 years ago, the Greeks used signal fires to relay news of the fall of Troy. Roman soldiers used polished shields to send messages by reflecting sunlight. First Nations peoples in North America communicated with smoke signals, as did Chinese soldiers stationed along the Great Wall. The British Royal Navy pioneered signal lamps in the late 1800s. Navies continue to use signal lamps today. They provide relatively secure communications and are especially useful during periods of radio silence. In the Second World War, they were essential to communications among naval and merchant marine convoys during the Battle of the Atlantic.
So what can you tell me about this object?
Actually, I know very little about it other than the fact that it was used for visual communications.
Quite right about that. I have seen these before. This is an Admiralty pattern 1038 signal lantern. It's World War II vintage. It may have been made in Canada. They were made to British Admiralty patterns in Commonwealth countries and in Great Britain itself, used mostly in naval vessels and in merchant naval vessels in convoys for signaling at night. You can take a look at it. You see the pieces here. The front has filters that allow you to reduce the intensity of the light. The light is already at a very low intensity. It has, I think, a very small bulb, like a single watt.
Yeah, 1 watt, yeah.
It gives you a sense of what this was intended to do, and that was to send signals covertly in contexts where vessels were in danger of being sunk. Modest little items, but they actually played an important role in ensuring that the Allied war effort during World War II continued unabated. The war effort in Europe was supplied from ports in North America, and vessels did not sail singly, individually as a rule. They would generally travel in convoys with naval escorts. And before they left port, all of the vessels in a convoy would be given sealed instructions that would tell them their course and would also give them directions to alter course in order to avoid detection by submarines. And U-boats, of course, would be forming lines across expected courses in the North Atlantic, just waiting for the prey to approach. Constantly changing course was one way that was intended to foil that interdiction at sea. And these little signal lamps allowed you to make those difficult, very sharp course corrections at sea in a coordinated fashion.
Why would they bother using something like this, visual communication, you have to see it as opposed to just getting on a radio?
Radio communications had some clear drawbacks. One of them being that it exposed your position to anybody who was listening. So it allowed you to communicate in a way that was extremely difficult to intercept. I'm also impressed by the fact that it's really, it's a humble object in many ways. It's very modest. A modest thing with a large impact. So Bill, I understand you're a military reenactor?
I am, yeah. When I do the World War II sauna, On the table with my static display, I'll have this lamp, and it does draw some attention to it. Once I added it to my collection, it kind of changed the way my whole display looked.
Yeah.
To have some visual communication device.
Particular periods that you prefer to reenact?
My favorite is 18th century. You know, I like the musket and black powder stuff and the outdoor campwear and whatnot. Another passion of mine is World War I, World War II, and Korea. I've gone to some of the encampments here in Halifax at the Citadel, and I've gone around to various museums in Atlantic Canada. People get to interact physically with some pieces of history, and plus a lot of reenactors are hams. You know, they like to show their stuff.
Yes.
I do enjoy interacting with people, and educating people is the main point.
Yeah. Some reenactors keep skills alive that otherwise would, just vanish from the earth as well.
In the Sackville, we had done some gun drills on the Sackville and whatnot.
Yeah.
Today's standards are a little bit different. During wartime, some standards were more extreme than they are today. I was brought up in a military family. My father was in the military, my grandfather was in the military, and my great-grandfather was in the military. And my brother and I were both in the military, so that was more like a stepping stone for me to get really interested in the first place. I mean, I started collecting since I was 9. So they would have used this mostly at night, but during the day, what would they use? Because a 1-watt bulb you wouldn't see very far.
Yeah, of course, they would need to maintain radio silence during the day as much as they would at night. So there were a number of ways that they could continue the visual signaling during the day. They could signal through flags, international or naval codes. You could also signal with lights, with signal projectors, but much more powerful ones as well that could similarly be focused. And some of the larger signal projectors on board naval vessels could be seen for 10, 20 miles.
Really?
You could bounce them off the clouds and see them for a heck of a lot longer. But really the point was, during the day as at night, to ensure that your signals weren't intercepted.
There's lots of ships in a convoy, so how do they all communicate if it's all visual?
It would usually start with the lead escort vessel, would communicate instructions to the rest of the ships. One of the key tasks at sea for convoys was keeping in a sort of coherent unit, and this tool could help with that. I like the lantern because it's a really sort of intimate artifact, something that you can handle and put yourself in the position of somebody on the rolling deck of a ship during the Battle of the Atlantic. Thanks so much for bringing this in, Bill. It's a really interesting object. What are your plans for the future with it?
Well, I plan to continue to use it in my displays, but the display will now be enhanced because of the information that I've learned today.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you so much for coming in today and for chatting. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. One of the main things I learned today was that communication is a very precise thing. More precise than I would have thought. Like, you're at sea, you'd think you're just flapping a light or something like that and everybody can see, but it's not. I'm going to continue to use it in displays, and it's one of those things that I've always had the public interact with, pick it up and play around with it and whatnot. After today, I have a little bit more information to enhance that aspect of my display.
Coming up on Militaria.
Jewish people had to buy these stars themselves. They were 4 cents. The Jewish people weren't allowed to work, so they had no income whatsoever. My name is Stella Vanderlut. The items that I brought today were given to me by my family members, specifically my grandmother and later my father. My grandmother was one of the most heroic women that I ever knew in my life.
Despite Dutch neutrality in the Second World War, Germany invaded the Netherlands in 1940. The Dutch forces surrendered in just 5 days, while the Dutch government and royal family fled to England. The Nazi occupation of the Netherlands was brutal, with citizens suffering through forced labour and malnutrition. For Dutch Jews, it was even worse. Only 27% of them survived the Holocaust. While some Dutch citizens hid Jews from the Germans, others collaborated with the Nazis and were paid a bounty for every Jew they captured. By the end of the war, more than 200,000 Dutch men, women, and children were dead, half of them Jews.
Welcome to the show, Stella. Thank you very much for coming in and bringing these wonderful artifacts.
Thank you, Gary. Yes, my grandmother moved to the Netherlands in 1924 after World War I, and she was brought in as a maid. My grandfather was married, the wife was sick, and my grandfather decided he needed someone to help him in the household. So they employed my grandmother.
Your grandfather's house is being the gentleman she eventually married?
Yes. My grandmother was basically the only one from her family who were sent to the Netherlands. She brought with her whatever she could carry. So in that can, she brought some jewelry.
It was sort of like a bit of an insurance policy for her in that if she had to, she could have turned it into cash.
Well, you have to understand that in Germany in the 30s, there was a huge depression. Mm-hmm. There was high unemployment. Most of the young men were killed. There was a big surplus of young unmarried women and, no money. So any wealth they had was basically in jewelry. It's the same goes for the Jewish people. What do you take with you? You take portable wealth with you.
Okay, so this artifact here that you brought in was, as you said, was Star David. The Jews in Europe from the Middle Ages were required to wear some form of identification on their clothing. How was it that your grandmother came upon this?
My grandmother had a boarding house when the war broke out. She knew that her young lady tenant who was engaged to this Jewish gentleman was going to be in danger. So they decided to hide him in the house with her. Next door to him was a Gestapo officer. And they had to be really quiet, of course. And he always was very polite to Miss Kroll. He always said to her, good morning, good afternoon, how are you? And she was like, if you only knew what we are having here. He has been hidden among the Germans since 1942 and hasn't been outside until the end of the war.
So he never left the house, so really the star didn't get much wear.
Correct. That's why it's in such great condition still.
If you were caught harboring a Jew, hiding them in your home or whatever, you would have been arrested, your family would have been arrested, and they would have been executed.
So Gary, you can understand that during a war situation where food is scarce and hiding someone and having an extra mouth to feed is difficult. My grandfather, as I mentioned, was an electrician. During the war, you had these food stamps, food coupons. So on the sheet of paper that you got were all these numbers, and only one of them was good. So you could have like flour, but you didn't have the number for it. So what he did, he took one of his electrician tools and he cut little pieces out the no good number to make the good number. So at some point the Germans found out, and he got sent to jail because they put one of these flashlights on it, and of course they could hold it up to the light and could see that it was put together.
So this final artifact that you brought in is basically a little portable handheld flashlight that doesn't require a battery. By squeezing it, you're pushing the generator and then the light comes on.
It's called a knijpkat, which I can translate as much as nipping cat. The word cat is in there because of the eye, looks like a cat eye, which provided some light in the dark years of World War II.
And I was wondering if you could tell us what it was like for the people in the built-up areas like Amsterdam.
As children, of course, you grow, and there were no shoes. So a lot of kids just walked around on bare feet. And of course, it wasn't very hygienic, so you got warts under your feet. So my father went there, he was 10 years old at that time, walked through Amsterdam, through the shoe store, came upon a blockade put up by the Germans, had to wait for 5 minutes. They shot 28 people right there. My father was a witness of that mass execution. And then the blockade was opened and he could go on his way. Went to the shoe store and got his warts removed. Another time he went with my older uncle, who's still alive, because they shot down an Allied plane and it landed on top of the church steeple. So the boys were there and said, wow, look at that. It was an English pilot in this case. He got out, parachuted out, but the plane landed right on the steeple and stayed there. So for them, it was really cool to see that burning plane. Of course, they were boys. He told me, you get used to the sounds. They were bombing, the Allies were bombing every night. You heard the planes, you heard the sirens, you saw dead people in the street. And he basically said to me, you get used to it, which is a horrific idea that you get used to violence of war. Now I'm getting a little emotional, but that's what happened. They were kids and resilient and therefore got used to it.
So Stella, you brought in some wonderful artifacts that would make a welcome addition to the Army Museum. And should you ever decide that you need a new home for them, we would welcome them. I can't imagine that you're prepared to give them up yet.
So during Memorial Week, I hope to get more, by the way, get invitations from schools to show these things, to tell the story, to have the children hold things in their hands, to see it firsthand. And yeah, hopefully I can do that for a number of years to come. But I will definitely keep you in mind if I'm done with my lectures at schools.
That'd be wonderful. Well, thank you so much for bringing the artifacts in and talking to us today. It has been a very informative session.
Thank you for having me.
The fact that her grandmother, who was German, did not believe in what was going on in Germany, didn't believe in National Socialism, stood against it, harbored a Jewish person and was successful in harboring them. And, if she was able to do it, there's probably a few others that did. So, these people were, some were saved, and it was because of normal, average people like Stella's grandmother.
Coming up on Militaria.
They stayed underneath the foliage the next morning when the German army woke them up and marched all the soldiers off. The only problem was they left 2 behind. So my name is Michael Renaud. I live here in Nova Scotia. I brought in today a photo album that was put together by my father-in-law, Don Buckler. He was a door gunner on a Halifax aircraft in the Second World War, bailed out of that aircraft and became a prisoner of war and ultimately escaped from the POW camp and made his way back to Allied lines.
Even war has rules, though not all nations abide by them. The Geneva Convention set out how World War II prisoners were to be treated. The Soviet Union hadn't signed on, and consequently, half of the Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans died, compared to less than 4% of Commonwealth prisoners of war. Life in a Nazi prison camp was difficult. The barracks were cold, food was scarce, and punishment for misbehavior was harsh. The lure to escape was strong, but of the 170,000 Commonwealth POWs held by the Germans, fewer than 1,200 made it to freedom. The journey to safety was long and dangerous, and capture could mean execution.
What have you brought for us today? It's kind of an interesting story, and I think it's a great story. So,
I brought a photo album here that belonged to my father-in-law, Donald Buckler. He was a gunner on a Halifax aircraft during the Second World War. He was shot down in March 1944, and he's kept all of his memorabilia in this album, including the telegraphs and telegrams that went out to his parents advising that he was shot down. Some letters that went back and forth between Don and his mom and his dad. And this is his collection of all of his memorabilia from that time.
what do you know about the story?
Wow. Okay. What do I know about the story? I know that on March the 15th, they took off from a base, they being the RCAF aircraft, Halifax type of aircraft, took off from their base in the United Kingdom for a sortie over Stuttgart. They were intercepted by a Luftwaffe aircraft. My father, Don, returned fire, but eventually the aircraft that they were in was declared disabled and the captain advised to abandon the ship. Everybody bailed out of the aircraft, including my father-in-law, Don. He landed safely, with the exception of a broken shoulder, near the zoo in Frankfurt and was captured by German citizens and turned over to the German army, at which time he was taken to a POW camp. Towards the end of the war, a determination was made by the German army to move these soldiers somewhere. We're not quite sure where, but they got them all together and marched them out onto the road, marched them all day long to a large field where they told them they could go and lay down and rest for the night. My father-in-law did with a friend of his, but they took the opportunity to hide under some leaves and chop down trees. They stayed underneath the foliage the next morning when the German army woke them up and marched all the soldiers off. The only problem was they left two behind, which of course was my father-in-law Don and his friend Pete. They escaped from the foliage and made their way back to Allied lines and were subsequently repatriated back to Canada.
On the night of March 15th, 1944, this particular raid was on Stuttgart in Germany. 1,161 aircraft were deployed, the largest raid at that particular point. The RAF Bomber Command was selecting industrial targets and also the cities at this point. And in 2 months' time, they would start focusing on going after the coastal defenses of France. So it was the last real push building up to the invasion in 1944. So let's see the archive that you brought today here. There's one particular item here I actually have cheated and looked at it already, but but I actually want to point this out to you. So this is his Caterpillar Club membership certificate.
He was very proud of this.
Right. So what that is the Irving Parachute Company, which made the parachute that he bailed out with, and it's signed by Leslie Irving. Is actually the actual signature on it.
Wow.
This was given to everyone that successfully bailed out of it. And there was also a gold pin that looked exactly like the Caterpillar that fit on their lapels, and that was included with it. And they sent it to him. But what's really kind of interesting with this particular note is it's actually sent to him in the prison camp in Germany, where he's a guest of the Luftwaffe.
Wow.
And that's actually his address. So they would have sent it to him as he was in.
Well, he must have got it.
Yeah, and brought it back with him. Actually, obviously kept it enough, and maybe this traveled back with him through the pockets.
Group 97 looks like where the prison camp maybe stamped it when they got it.
That's right, yeah, exactly. So that's what we're seeing. And it looks like the original signature of that. So
that's incredible.
The process to actually send it out to obviously if they were prisoners of war and they bailed out, that's what they sent it through. So the system was obviously working that he received that. So.
And the gold pin is still in his artifacts back in Bear River. So the gold pin did come through with it.
That's good, because again, obviously that's the key to that, and you can always see that with that particular.
Wow. You know, I think when he pointed out that Dad's Caterpillar Club letter went to the POW camp as opposed to coming back here to Canada was fascinating. I hadn't noticed that before. I'd looked at the letter, dozens of times and had never noticed that. So that was great.
So I'd like to thank you, Michael, for bringing this fantastic collection of items from your family archives.
You're welcome.
What's the long-term plans here? What's going to happen to the archive?
Well, this has to remain in our family. Don has grandsons and granddaughters that are certainly more than interested in this. He has a granddaughter lives in Los Angeles that keeps his medals, and she has expressed her interest in this. So it definitely has to remain in the family.
And obviously, it's a great story that we've learned a bit more about today, and obviously you can add to this archive as well now too, and I think that's another takeaway from today, is that you'll be able to add more to the story.
Absolutely. I've learned things here today that I would have never known without you. Thank you.
Don's story is about a Nova Scotian boy going to war, and I think it's all about maintaining the history. It's important that a relatively young man can go to war, do his service, survive it, and then actually going on to lead a relatively normal life.
You know, I think it's important that we keep this history, that we're able to remember it so that our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren can see this stuff and understand, what it was like back in the 1940s.